We're all ready. We're going to thank you, everyone. Welcome to Controversies in Church History, a monthly course we're presenting here at Our Lady of Sorrows. And last time, the first meeting, we discussed, I gave a talk on deaconesses in the early church. Somebody trying to get in? Yeah, thank you, Virgil. This month, talk is going to cover the Crusades, which is obviously a controversial topic in Christian history. And so the question, the title of the lecture is A Perversion of Christian Faith, because this is one of the things that at least modern versions of Christianity and modern thinkers tend to view it as. So, I'm going to begin with a little introduction, which, if you haven't seen the movie Kingdom of Heaven, I like memes. If you were in my first lecture, there were a lot of these things in here. And I'm starting with this movie, if you haven't seen it. It's a movie by Ridley Scott, 2005. And by the way, I don't mean to make light of the conquest of Jerusalem. It's a brutal thing. But the film, if you haven't seen it, it's a visually beautiful film. It's also, in terms of its historical accuracy, complete garbage. And it's one of the worst films out there, yet it made a lot of money. It was very popular. And I begin with this because it pretty much, if you've ever seen it, I guess it's kind of worth seeing. I begin with it because it kind of encapsulates every single misconception I think people have about the Crusades. In general, you have in this movie, if you don't know the film, the central character is this almost sort of agnostic who's on the Christian side, and of course every Christian basically in the film besides him is a bloodthirsty fiend whose only goal in life is to kill people without provocation, take their land. And of course his counterpart in the film, we'll talk about Saladin in this lecture, is the good pious Muslim who is also courteous and gentle and all these other sorts of things. And it's basically all a big fight about nothing. And again, I can't stress, I really do like Ridley Scott, by the way, as a director. We owe him a great debt of gratitude. If you've ever seen, I'm sure you have, seen the film Gladiator, which is also historical rubbish, but he almost single-handedly resurrected the historical epic and brought it back into fashion. So we owe him that, even if we have to make fun of him and Orlando Bloom for their efforts. But I mention this because I want to start out, this is kind of the image, the caricature of the Crusades I want to, if you like, exercise from your minds, because it's the one you probably have in your minds. And I don't mean, by the way, to apologize for any atrocities committed by Crusaders. They did do that on occasion. But to give us a more balanced presentation of what it was they did and why they did it. And so a little brief introduction about the controversy itself. Is this a modern controversy? For the most part, yes. Up through the, I would say, 16th centuries, in the 17th century, it was not really a controversy that, okay, were the Crusades unjust wars? Were they wars of colonial expansion? For the most part, that wasn't the case. There were, however, criticisms, contemporary criticisms, even dating from the First Crusades, about the legitimacy of what was going on. They were always a minority. They were there. They were never that strong, not as strong as you would think, actually, in certain degrees. And certainly get toward the later Middle Ages, when you get toward the different Crusades, after the first several to the Middle East, you'll have some more criticism. But for the most part, it was seen in a positive light. Now, when does this, controversy really begin? When do you get people really sort of denigrating the Crusades as being, mindless fanaticism, motivated by greed, motivated by desire for land, is in the Enlightenment. Enlightenment historians like Voltaire, like Edward Gibbon. Gibbon is a little more fair in terms of, at least giving you some appreciation of what the Crusaders went through. But for the most part, they see it as a work of superstition, fanaticism, passe violence. The other place you get a lot of these caricatures from are from Romantic authors of the 19th century, in both a positive and a negative sense. You're going to have a romanticized view of the Crusaders as always being, courteous and chivalrous and, helping the little ladies across the pond, all that stuff. You're also going to have a romantic myth that's associated with people like Sir Walter Scott, the great novelist, who in one of his novels, I can't remember which one, depicts, again, kind of what you get in Kingdom of Heaven. The brutal, ignorant, stupid, pretty much vicious crusaders versus the noble, more sophisticated, whatever, Muslims. The caricature where it's sort of, pretty simplistic. That comes from the Romantics. And so that's influenced us in a lot of ways in the modern world. And what's happened, though, in the last 75 to 100 years is that modern academic scholarship has gotten beyond these caricatures. There is a boon in Crusade scholarship to this day. I mean, it's you can go into the bookstore. There's plenty of good books, actually. One of the things I'm going to do, by the way, is I'm going to post on our page my notes, the outlines, and everything. I'm also going to post this video. Also going to post the sources I used for this lecture and other stuff I didn't. So I compiled a bunch of stuff, internet stuff, but also books. If you want to go learn about it, there's a lot of stuff out there. And they have, for the most part, gone away from this idea, this very heavily negative ideal of the Crusades as being, it's about mere plunder, it's about mere material gain and stuff like this. And reassessed its place in the Middle Ages and what it was about. However, the second thing to note about this is that almost none of this scholarship has permeated popular culture. Kingdom of Heaven is a dozen years old. Film is a lot more powerful than any book. And this is the default understanding of the Crusades. And I say this again, let me stress here, I'm not here to tell you everything the Crusaders did was wonderful. It wasn't. But it does not mean that they were all bloodthirsty fanatics, and it's nothing like that film. And by the way, could you please hold your questions to the end of the talk? I have a lot of stuff to go through. I'll take all your questions, but I want to get where I'm going first, all right? So relevant. It is very relevant, but we're going to come back to this in a moment. But please save questions to the end. And so that's my little intro. One last thing, and I mentioned this last time, and I'll mention it every time I do this. History is complicated. Always remember that when we come to talk about this. And again, I'm assuming everybody here is Catholic, even if you're not. The faith is something, it's something everybody can understand. History, it's complicated. And I should also point out, by the way, that I am not an expert in the Crusades. If you don't know, I forgot to introduce myself. Hi, I'm Derek Taylor. I'm a professor at Johnson County Community College. The Crusades are not my primary area of study. I am not an expert, so keep that in mind. Take that with a grain of salt. I'm offering this course as, using my research skills to learn this and offer it to the young adult community and anyone else who wants to learn, obviously. The other thing, besides me not being a specialist of the Crusades, is not a theologian. Definitely not a theologian. Long story short, I'm a convert to the faith. I have actually very little formal theological training, so keep that all in mind as we go forward. And so I want to frame the rest of my talk in terms of 4 questions, and we'll give 4 answers to these questions at the end, something you can take away from this. The first question may sound odd. What was a crusade? Everybody probably has in their mind, I know what a crusade is. Again, this is academics. Sometimes academics make things more complicated than they have to. They're actually right here. It's actually a little more complicated than you think to identify what a crusade was. We'll come back to this. The first question. The second question we want to answer is, were Crusaders motivated by religion? Because you can kind of guess from what I've said already. This is one of the major critiques amongst them. And again, the basic thinking is, hey, how can you go, slaughter people for Christ? That doesn't sound exactly Christian to a lot of people. It's a real question, one that deserves a serious answer. The third question goes back to the nature of the wars themselves. Were the Crusades unjust wars? Because again, in the popular image, you have a lot of people, it's only hinted at in Kingdom of Heaven, but the idea is the Crusades were completely unprovoked. They were aggressive war. They were wars that had no real justification, according to traditional standards of Christian, morality for that, but also just in modern terms, which is something we'll also talk about as well. And then finally, and this is the big question for Catholics, and I wanted to bring this to, is were the Crusades a perversion of the gospel message? And so I'm going to come back each one of these at the end. We'll give a provisional answer to these things, and something you can take away as you're going forward. Okay. Yes, so first question. What was a crusade? And this is something that, again, as I mentioned earlier, may sound easy, but there are problems with defining this. Not the least of which is the word crusade was never used by crusaders in the Middle Ages. It is a modern term. In French, I think it enters the language in the 16th century. It doesn't enter English language in a broad way till the 17th century, to the 1600s. So you were talking about a later sort of clarification of things that weren't always clear on the ground. There was never a time when anybody sat down, no theologian said, this is what a crusade is, this is, Thomas Aquinas never did this. So it's one of those things that was a practical matter, maybe with a few exceptions in history. And there are several different schools of thought on this. And again, you're wondering, okay, isn't this about the Middle East? Isn't this about taking land from the Muslims? Isn't this about taking Jerusalem back? And in some ways it is. This is, by the way, I won't go through all of them. One of the schools of thought on this is called the traditionalist interpretation, which identifies there's only really a few crusades, and they're all about the Holy Land. They number them usually the first, the fourth, second, third, fourth. There's like 5 or 6 of them, or however they number. Even that's kind of arbitrary and not really accurate. But it has to do with retaking of Jerusalem and the holy sites there and nothing else. One other sort of view of this is that it's sometimes called the generalist interpretation, is that crusade is just a term for a holy war, right? A generic term for, like, it'd be like jihad in Islam. Crusade is just a holy war in generic, anything that can be, any sort of cause that can be linked to fighting for God, basically. The third one, I mentioned this third one because this is the one more or less I'm going on. This is what's called the pluralist interpretation. And the pluralists basically view crusading in much wider terms than just going to take the Middle East, although that's still one of the most important things to crusaders in the Middle Ages. And in particular because it identifies certain aspects that the historians think are constant across a lot of these different wars we're talking about here. And in particular, I'm going on the definition of Jonathan Riley Smith, who was a late historian of the Crusades, and I'll quote him here. Quote, what makes a crusade different? What type of, it is a holy war, but what type of it, what kind of type of it is? And he says, quote, crusades were penitential war pilgrimages, holy because waged on God's behalf, and penitential because those taking part considered themselves to be performing an act of penance, unquote. And let me explain that for a moment. What's going to happen, we'll talk about the chronology and everything, but it's really crucial. The thing that makes the Crusades a religious event for contemporaries, for people who took the cross, took the time, trouble, and effort to go to the Holy Land, to go to Spain, to go lots of other places, to fight non-Christians, basically, and defend the faith as they understood it, was that in the 11th century, popes and other theologians in charge of the church came up with a fairly novel idea that if you're fighting in a war for defense of the faith, for a defense of the church, defense of Christians, that could be counted as an act of penance, like going on a pilgrimage, like doing, charitable works. And in fact, one of the things he mentions there was a war pilgrimage. The whole idea of pilgrimage is very important, especially the first Crusades, because in some ways, as you're going to see, the goal was Jerusalem in the first Crusade, and pilgrimage to Jerusalem was the sort of major destination for Christians in the Middle Ages. And they almost thought of this, the first Crusades, they talked about it, a lot of preachers did, as if it were, and this is kind of contradictory, an armed pilgrimage. You weren't supposed to go on pilgrimage armed. But this is the way they began to conceive of it when it first breaks out. And so you have a specific holy war which is supposed to be penitential. That's one of the main things you take away from this, with, of course, the Crusades of the East being the most important ones. But as we're going to see, there are a much, much wider berth for what we're talking about in terms of, I'm going next, for what they're doing. The second thing I want to note about Crusades is they are not, and you have to think of this, it's hard actually for us to think in these terms. Crusades are not wars waged by nation states. It's not, one exception, we'll get to it. They are waged by individual knights drawn from the entire Western, to some extent, Eastern world. Why is that important? They're voluntary. Nobody is forcing people to go take up the cross, as the term becomes. They're voluntary knights. They go, a lot of times their goal is to go liberate, say, Jerusalem, go there, worship, and then go back home. And that's it. That is mostly what Crusaders do. Most of them do not go to the Holy Land, carve up some territory, get a feudal estate. No, they liberate whatever city, they fight, defend the whatever Crusader states, they worship at the shrines, they go home. That is mostly what crusading is about. And it is complete, when I say voluntary, not just the vows that people make. As we're going to see going and talk about the Crusader states, these states are not really self-sufficient. They have to be funded from Europe by subsidies from the papacy, from religious orders in Europe. My point is they don't exploit the population enough to actually live on their own. That's not their goal. Their whole goal is to have control of those holy sites, unencumbered from Muslim rule. And so that's one thing to keep in mind. It's a very odd, in some ways amazing undertaking, but it's not what you think in modern terms that way. And so next thing to talk about is the chronology of this, and this is kind of complicated because it depends on how you define some of these wars. The First Crusade takes place in 1096. We'll come to that. I'm dating, and I have the question mark up there because this is my view of this. The last crusade would be the Siege of Vienna in 1683. We'll get to the Ottomans in a second, but the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Muslim Empire from Central Asia, makes its way several times into Austria. Comes very close to conquering it twice. That's really the last one in those terms, if you think about it as a defensive war against Christendom. There is, by the way, you could, if you wanted to, actually stretch this to the 19th century. That's how long-lived this idea is, and hopefully it'll make sense when I say what that is going forward. And so a longer history than you think. And then finally, the geography of this. Again, in our imagination, it's Jerusalem, which is, that actually makes a lot of sense in medieval terms because in Middle Ages, of course, you see medieval maps, Jerusalem's the center of the universe, and people took that very deadly seriously. But there were crusades, and I mean crusades where the Pope, we'll talk about this in a second, gave people, the idea, by the way, about penance was you got remission of sins for doing this. So he granted people remission of sins, not just for crusades to the Holy Land, but crusades to Spain, to retake Spain from the Muslim armies there, crusades in Western France, crusades in Northern Africa, in Morocco and Egypt, crusades in Northern Europe, in the Baltic Sea, against Finland, Estonia, Lithuania, Prussia, in the Balkans, Greece, the Middle East, to Constantinople to try to save Constantinople in the 15th century, and even naval battles. This takes place. This is a Christendom-wide set of events, basically. Much bigger in scope, much more ambitious than you'd probably think at first, and I'll come back to that, but I'm going with that just to give you an idea of how broad this is. Okay, so that's the first question. It is a penitential war pilgrimage fought against, and by the way, I should add this caveat, wherever it can be justified, and by the way, it's not always justified, but wherever it can be justified, that it's a defensive war, a reactive war against attacks on the faith. And we'll come back to how accurate that was at a moment toward the end, but I want to move forward. So the second question, were Crusaders motivated by religion? So, first thing to note is that it's true that virtually everybody is motivated by mixed motives, even the most deeply religious people. And I'm thinking, we'll come to the First Crusade again, the Pope who called for the First Crusade, Urban II. He assuredly, as I'm going to explain, had religious motives for what he was doing. It was not merely, and we'll come to the debate about this, but it was not merely he wanted to go conquer the East or, slay the infidels. It wasn't quite that. He did have, by the way, the idea that if you got some of these very, very violent Western knights out of Europe, it might be a good thing. Yeah, and channel some of their energies into what might be a more worthy cause. Sure. He had political, by the way, ideas behind his crusade. I'll get to them. And they're actually fairly noble political ones, but they're there as well. So keep that in mind. Mixed motives are a part of human nature, and there's no reason to expect even saints to have always perfect motives. Actually, I'll have an example of this, by the way, a saint who was calling for a crusade, who kind of went off the rails a little bit in calling for them. So mixed motives is one thing. But the next thing I have to talk about are older theories of motivation. When we talk about caricatures of the motivations of these crusaders, a lot of this goes back to, I mentioned the Enlightenment and things like this, but it gets into scholarship. And for a long time, you did have, it was a prevailing theory of, motivation by greed, just a lust for plunder with religion as a cloak. You also had more sophisticated theories. In particular, and I mentioned one already, this is the social outlet theory. I call it the idea that you're getting these violent knights out of Europe and giving them something to do so you don't terrorize your own population. More prominent than this is a theory that has been thoroughly debunked, but sometimes called the younger son theory. This is the idea that in medieval Europe, if you don't know, inheritance laws were such that, if you know what primogeniture is, when you died and you left your property, you had to leave it to your eldest son. Again, the whole idea was to keep your estate together, which meant your younger sons got nothing. So the idea was, well, these crusaders must have just been these younger sons of nobility. They sent them off to the Middle East, carve up some land, get their estates. Almost totally false. Most of the people who actually went were, in fact, the eldest sons. They were, in fact, risking a lot because they had to go and hawk a lot of them to actually get the money to raise for armor, horses, provisions, people to whatever, all the entourage that goes with it was enormously expensive. Total bunk, basically, that theory. The last one, of course, is religious fanaticism. And again, there's evidence, by the way, there were fanatics among the Crusaders. Surprise, surprise. I wouldn't want to rule them out, but it doesn't explain. It doesn't explain the whole movement because, and this is the thing, it wasn't just people who were obviously kind of half-cocked. Perfectly normal people were enthused about this. Barely noble people who were enthused about this. And so, okay, what is the evidence for this, and why can we be sure about this? One I kind of hinted at already, the expense and the danger of a crusade. You might, first of all, have to raise all this money. You might leave your estates behind, by the way, where you're gone for several years. And we have records of people leaving their estates behind with their wives in charge, and while they're gone, somebody who doesn't like them very much or wants their land initiates a lawsuit in court and wants to take his estates and stuff like this. People lost sometimes a lot in these ventures. And of course, danger. A lot of them died and didn't come back. It is hard to explain why so many people, and again, it's a small portion of Europe as a whole, but so many over so many centuries did this just for material gain. There were easier ways to make money, even in the Middle Ages. Very few prospered. A few did. And when you come to the Crusader states, some of them became kings of Jerusalem, counts of Tripoli, counts of Edessa. For the most part, that was not the case with most of them. And most of them, again, this was like an armed pilgrimage. They liberated the holy sites, worship, go back home. In fact, the only thing, basically, another reason, evidence, we know this wasn't about money or material gain. The only thing that Crusaders brought back when they came back from the Middle East in large quantities were relics. And of course, relics are for veneration, and the church would not allow you to sell them, so you could not make money off of it. So there's just not a lot of evidence, and I say this, I had a chance to ask Jonathan Riley Smith, the late Jonathan Riley Smith, he died last year, when he came to KU several years ago. He was giving a talk on this, and I kind of agreed with him. I kind of knew, I was like, okay, is there any evidence for this materialist interpretation? And he's, in Cambridge accent goes, there is no evidence, none whatsoever. Not all. It's very insistent upon it. It really is hard to find the bloodthirsty, greedy fanatics for the most part. Yes, you can find some, but on the whole, not really a true, clear picture of the Crusaders. One last thing to mention about this, and keep this in mind, is what counts as religious motivation. I say this because there are obviously things, even a lot of you here I know are practicing Catholics. We're still modern. There are things that we count as secular or not religious that our ancestors in the Middle Ages, they're all the same thing. The whole world's kind of religious in that sense. Modern society has very different definitions of what counts as a good war, a justifiable war. And largely this means, humanitarian wars. Modern Christians tend to look askance at violence. We're going to talk about this in a second, the role of violence in early Christianity and medieval Christianity. And so sometimes I think there's anachronism involved in looking back and judging them. And we'll come to this. I don't mean to excuse things that went on, but it's a mistake to judge people in the past by modern standards, or at least as harshly as I think a lot of people do. If you're trying to be fair. If you just want polemics out of this, yeah, you'll just go do whatever. But if we're trying to be fair, I'm being, by the way, fair to the Islamic armies as well. I'm not just talking about the Christian ones. All pre-modern peoples have a different view of things than we do. And so those, and so in terms of motivated by religion, they were clearly, I think. I don't just mean the Pope, the clergy who were preaching this, the Crusaders themselves, and most of them, by the way, are not educated. They're not theologians, but they understood penance pretty well. They understood they had to make reparations for their sin. They had been convinced, even though most of them were very violent people, that this was sinful. We know this because they, starting in the 11th century, they begin donating lots and lots of money to pay for masses for their souls after they die. And the doctrine of purgatory is very important to them. They know they're sinful and might not make it. And so this is why that idea of penance appeals so strongly to them. They're still, I don't want to say, it's wrong to call them semi-pagan. They're just really inured to warfare. And again, I don't mean to make excuses, but you can think of them as being inured to warfare like our society is inured to sex. Everybody does it. Why is it sinful? You get the idea. And so it's hard for them to separate that they took their sinful nature seriously. So we come to the third question. Were the Crusades unjust wars? And this question, which, if you didn't see my first lecture, there was a lot more of this, but this is a more serious topic, so I couldn't quite... Yeah, it's Monty Python. It's not the Crusades, but no, there is. This is one of the. This is I shouldn't have done. This is a serious charge. Are these wars unjust? And in particular, I'll come to this at the end of this little section. Are these wars of colonial domination? Need to come back to that one. These are serious questions. That's why I began with Monty Python. Let's talk about the First Crusade. This is the one people kind of know about. So. And I should probably talk a little bit about the relationship of Islam with Islam prior to the Crusades in the Holy Land. The Muslims have, of course, conquered the Middle East in the 7th century. They'd held it in perpetuity ever since. And one thing to note, because this will be part of a justification for the Crusade, they had, for the most part, been fine with Christian pilgrims coming to the Holy Land. They wanted their money. They weren't about to turn them away. So we have records of English monks making it to Jerusalem in the 7th century, totally unmolested. However, what's going to happen in the decades just prior to, 3 or 4 decades prior to the First Crusade, is that there's going to be kind of a shift in power in the Muslim world. I don't have a map, and it probably wouldn't help you. I don't want to confuse you anymore with all the information I'm going to dump on you, but the Abbasid Caliphate, centered on Baghdad, had been more or less in control of the Middle East, Palestine area. They were overrun and taken over by a Turkic people called the Seljuk Turks, who they sort of took over Baghdad, put a sort of, and again, this is partly, I should mention this, partly ethnic in nature. It's an mostly Arab empire. They overthrow the Arabs, and a Turkish people take over the Caliphate in Baghdad. Which breaks up the area of Palestine into a bunch of little prince-linked states ruled by Arabs who are fighting with the Seljuks. And by the way, they don't like each other very much for ethnic reasons. And so that amounts to sort of like quasi-civil war in the 1060s, 1070s. And we do have evidence that, by the way, Christians got caught up in this and got targeted, especially pilgrims, and killed. Again, how bad was this? We'll get to this in a moment. The Pope in 1095, tells lurid stories of massacres, according to some accounts. We're not really sure. It does seem that pilgrims have been attacked. Again, not immediately. This probably ends in the 1080s, at least a decade before the Crusades called, but it's in recent memory. And so there have been some tensions in the Middle East that were building up to this. But more than that, the Seljuk Turks begin eating into the Byzantine Empire. If you know what the Byzantine Empire is, this is the East Roman Empire. The empire centered on Constantinople, which, when the Western Empire fell, it went on. And it, in fact, is the center, really, of the Christian world at this point. Constantinople is the most wealthy, most brilliant city in the Christian world. And by 1095, the Seljuks have gotten fairly close to Constantinople. So the Byzantine emperor sends an embassy to the Pope, Urban II, asking him to send some Western knights to aid them in their wars against the Seljuk Turks. Now, what happens is, Urban II, who, by the way, was really deeply concerned with, had probably a more deep concern with what was happening in the East than anybody in Western Christendom, and probably anybody in Western Christendom for several generations. If you don't know, there had been a schism that opened up between the Eastern Orthodox Christians and the Latin Christians in 1054. He wanted to heal this breach, and he was genuinely concerned about what was going on. He also, however, had a couple of other things in mind. One of the things was that he wanted to, first of all, liberate what he thought of as the Eastern churches from Muslim rule. He also wanted to liberate Jerusalem, especially, and the holy sites from their rule. I mention this, by the way, because the Byzantines were on board with the first. They didn't ask for the second. And that what they didn't ask for, by the way, was what he came up with. He went on preaching tours, first at Clermont in France, where he announced this crusade, where he offered, again, a remission of sin if people took up the cross, took up their swords or whatever, and went to the Holy Land and removed the threat from pilgrims and from Christians in the Holy Land. And he put this, and again, we have several different versions of his speech at Clermont. Some are more lurid than the others. Some are more restrained. It's hard to know which one's right. But apparently he tapped into something because the response was electric. All across Europe, from England to France to Spain to the German states, people volunteered to go and try to retake the Holy Land. Partly because, and I had to mention this, I'll repeat myself, but Jerusalem had a powerful effect on people's imaginations. They desperately wanted to go there. Again, the pilgrimage was the most popular in Europe. I guess maybe that or Compostela. And this was pitched in terms of it was almost going to be like a sort of armed pilgrimage in a way. You can go liberate Jerusalem, worship there, remit your sins. This is powerful for them. And so they do. And in fact, I don't have time to go into this in too much detail. They finally set off in 1096 or 1097. Actually, several different armies at several different intervals set off. The first army gets dispersed and slaughtered on the way down there. And by the way, they make their way, explain why this is important, they make their way by land, not by sea. I think it's because it's very dangerous, and it's really amazing they actually made it through without getting killed. Partly because Alexios I helped them out. He did sort of direct them toward the Holy Land and then split, because that was not why he asked them to come. And by the way, he was not asking for armies of 10 to 20,000 people, which is what he got. Which, first of all, they couldn't really provision several armies that big. And secondly, it kind of disturbed them because, again, some of those crusaders were looking at Constantinople going, pretty, can we take it? There was always a lot of tension from the beginning between the Latin and the Greeks, unfortunately. They did have a lot of cooperation, but there was tension from the beginning for a lot of reasons. But against virtually all odds, and they should have been wiped out a couple of times, the main body, the main army of experienced knights, made it to the Holy Land in 1098, eventually took Edessa. The siege of Antioch is, in fact, the turning point in the war. I can't go through it. It's a riveting account if you go look at it. Tripoli, and then finally, and this is the big, and I'll come back to this, the big sort of denouement of this, and that should be Jerusalem, not Jerusalem. They sack the city of Jerusalem in 1099 and take the city. And you've probably heard accounts of this. The accounts are really lurid, and we'll come back to this, but slaughter the male inhabitants, sell everybody else into slavery, that sort of thing. We will come back to this. And so you have this call to go take, and again, it was in response to, a call for aid. So that could be seen in, of course, a defensive light. That's the main body. We're going to move to the Crusader states here in a second. Because, of course, you have this initial wave. And by the way, at its height, the Crusader states encompassed a 600-mile-long stretch of land, and there were something like, at its height, 150,000 Latin settlers in the kingdoms of the Crusader states. Again, tiny, not very big, surrounded by Muslim powers who could throw much larger armies at them. And so one of the things that needs to be pointed out, I mentioned this earlier, is the tenuous financial situation of these states. There were kind of quasi-feudal kingdoms, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Counts of Edessa and Tripoli. Edessa gets done within 30 or 40 years, it's gone. But you do have sort of quasi-feudal estates in which there will be, by the way, Muslim, Jewish people along with Eastern Christians, who I should mention, by the way, especially the Armenians. They actually helped the Crusaders in their during the First Crusade to help pull some of this off. They're primarily, I mentioned before, interested in defending those religious sites. And in fact, they don't really make a lot of money out of the territories that they control. I mean, in feudal terms, these are sort of quasi-feudal societies. The one way they do make money out of this are tax collection, customs from the port cities they've taken. Acre more than any others, but it's one of the more prosperous ports in the Mediterranean. But they still, again, require not only subsidies from Europe, eventually to defend themselves, because this is the other thing. The rest of the Crusades are basically in defense of these territories, so they are defensive wars. They have to have other Crusades to come help them out. They do not have enough people. They're never able to attract settlers from the West. That was never their rationale. They didn't want to go there to settle. They wanted to go there to free the holy sites, go back. One thing I should also mention, by the way, is there was a high degree of, for the most part, of religious toleration in these Crusader states. That does not mean legal equality. They were not. In fact, basically everybody, Eastern Christians included, were legally inferior to Latin Western Christians. On the whole, however, there was pretty peaceful relationships between the Crusaders, local Muslims, Jews. And by the way, I don't think that's necessarily because these Crusaders were sweethearts. It wasn't. It's because they were a tiny minority and could not afford to offend everybody. But they were not vicious. They were not intolerant in that way, for the most part. Again, exceptions here and there I don't know about, but I'm sure they exist. And as I mentioned before, reliant on men from Europe, increasingly especially by the end of the 12th century. With the first and second and third Crusades, they're increasingly reliantly in military terms on the military orders, which I'll get to in a moment if I have time. This is taking a lot longer than I thought it would, to actually run their armies. They were very, very crucial. The Knights Templar, the Knights Hospitallers, in this period. And these states, and I'm going to skim over the Second and Third Crusades, they lose. Basically, they fight to a draw in 1189 against Saladin. But the Crusader states last for almost 200 years, and it's quite amazing they lasted that long. There was never any real chance they were going to hold these territories. I take that back. If they had been willing to work with the Byzantine emperors and maybe hand over those territories to them, they might have had a powerful enough state to keep them. The Western, it was a matter of time. The Muslim surrounding armies were, and this is one of the reasons, by the way, why the First Crusade was so successful. They were in disarray, as I kind of indicated. Once they found a leader, they found two of them actually, a man named Nur ad-Din, who led the defeat of the Second Crusade, and then Saladin, who retook Jerusalem in 1187, his successor. They finally began to push them back. And another 100 years, of course, the last city-state, Acre, falls in 1291, and they are pushed out. It was more or less inevitable, basically, from the beginning. Now, I want to compare that with what goes on in Spain, because I mentioned before, okay, that's the traditional, that's the backbone of crusading. You also had the Reconquista in Spain. Now, and this is complicated because Islamic armies conquered Spain in the early 8th century. And almost from the beginning, they never actually did conquer the entire peninsula. So there were northern kingdoms up in the mountains where they couldn't reach, didn't want to reach, who kind of resisted. And you could kind of see the Reconquista starting right then. Depends on this is still a matter of debate among Spanish and medieval historians. But by the 9th century, clearly there's already the kingdom of Asturias in northern Spain. They're already thinking in terms of, okay, our wars are wars of reconquest. Even though they look like border wars where there's a raiding back and forth, they're still talking about it like that. And what happens, they don't have a lot of success until the 11th century. Why? Because the Umayyad dynasty in southern Spain, the main body, the main caliphate there, collapses in 1031. And in the next 50 years, they begin to push farther and farther into southern Spain, till in 1085, they retake the city of Toledo. And Toledo, if you don't know, was the old capital of Spain in the Visigothic period prior to the Islamic conquest. And from that point on, it's pretty much, it's a done deal, actually. They're going to start moving south, and they do. But what happens after 1085 is the Crusader ideology associated with the papacy, with the Crusades of the East, enters into Spain. The popes begin issuing papal bulls, granting the same sort of indulgences, remissions of sin to people in Spain. And it will take on more and more of that character, which it's basically completed by 1248. They take Cordoba, that's the last major kingdom. I don't know the rationale. They let Granada, which is in southern Spain, a tiny state, exist for another couple hundred years, and it falls in 1492. The one thing to note about this is, very different almost from the beginning though, once that ideology comes in there, is this is much more a national crusade. It's run by the kings of Spain. It's financed by the church in Spain, but it is almost wholly self-contained. You do have, Knights Templars, orders having, military orders setting up there. You will have people coming from outside of Spain, but for the most part, it's sort of like a war of national liberation. They use that term, liberación, from the 11th century onward. So again, in modern context, if you wanted to see it this way, this is a war of colonial liberation. It's an independence movement. That's not the way it's been seen in the past, but more historians are more open to that these days. So again, a slightly different set of events than you have in the Middle East. But there are a couple of other types of crusades, arenas of crusade. I want to mention this one in particular. Particularly the Northern Crusades. We're talking about mostly against Baltic peoples who were pagans, starting in the 12th century. The first crusade against in the north is 1147, the same year as the Second Crusade, which is preached by which are preached up by Bernard of Clairvaux, Saint Bernard. And I should stress, not all the wars, and there are many, many wars that occur in this region, in Prussia, in Poland, in Lithuania, those places. Not all of them. The first one was, and there were several others against Estonia. Those places, they had the same sort of, you take the cross, you get the indulgence, you make the vows. Not all these were. And sometimes you have kings, Christian kings in the north, treating this as sort of like, God's war is for us to go take the territory of these pagans. My point is that it's a lot more ambivalent, the actual rationale for these. Now, by the way, from the beginning, they did have, one of the justifications was defense of missionary settlements. And it's true, in earlier centuries, there had been, priests martyred by pagans, and they were expansionist as well. The kingdom of Lithuania, for example, was a big expansionist kingdom, pagan one, before it converted to Christianity. That having been said, in the north, some of these wars were justified explicitly with the idea of forcible conversion. Some of them also were, some of them also tended to sort of blur that line between, okay, we want to defend these settlements, and let's go like do things like burn down pagan shrines. It was pretty violent. And again, this goes back to, by the way, if you know the story of Saint Boniface, the missionary to Germany, where he goes, they have this sacred tree, Woden, the sacred tree of Woden. He just goes in there with an axe and whacks it down. Violence against, pagan shrines it's kind of normal for these people. For them, you have to remember, these pagan shrines aren't inert things. They are sort of like the instruments of demons. They're actively doing evil. You have to attack them. You have to fight them. And yes, that does transfer, unfortunately, over to people as well sometimes. One thing also that deserves mention is the role of the Teutonic Knights, and I'm going into too much detail here. I have so much more to get through. The Teutonic Knights were actually formed in Acre in the Middle East in the 13th century, before the fall of that kingdom. Once it falls, they have, and by the way, all these orders have multiple holdings across Europe. They shift their base back to Europe, and especially to Prussia, where again, there's pagans there, they're fighting a crusade. And it turns into what sometimes historians call a perpetual crusade. And what I mean by that is popes try to control this, right? They're the only ones with the authority to issue these indulgences and stuff like this. They granted the Teutonic Knights, for various reasons, a dispensation to issue their own indulgences for remissions of sin. They could basically do this to attract followers. I mention this because if this sounds like an abuse, it kind of probably was. That caricature you got from the Kingdom of Heaven probably comes closer to the Prussian-ruled theocratic state, and it is a theocratic state, of the Teutonic Knights than anywhere else. In fact, the whole conversion of the Baltic region, actually, if you're going to think in terms of this colonial imposition of this foreign power, which is imposing a religion on someone, it really fits this much better than the Middle East. Of course, most of the Baltic was pagan. Some of them were forcibly converted. And it's totally transformed. It is a fully integrated part of, Latin Western Christendom by the 1500s. It's part of the Western European market system, changes its region beyond all, not beyond all recognition, but it's really transformed in a way that is not really the same way in the Holy Land, and not the same way, I would say, in Spain. Which brings me to one last arena I have to mention, because going back to this idea of being defensive, these Crusades, the ones against the Ottomans, are all entirely defensive. Because the Ottoman, if you know where this comes from, is Turkish peoples that sort of replaced the Seljuks in the 14th century, associated with a man, Osman, the House of Osman, which managed to make themselves the dominant power in Anatolia, and will become the dominant power in the Muslim world by eating up and conquering what's left of the Byzantine Empire in the 14th and 15th centuries. And so you have several Crusades. Actually starting in the early 14th century, naval battles with the Ottomans. You have several Crusades sent to stop them. They all fail, unfortunately. You have Crusade 1 actually does successfully divert them from Constantinople. I mean, Western troops going there doing this. And Byzantine emperors go several times to Europe looking for help. And they try several times. If you know, by the way, know what the Council of Florence was, Council of Florence Ferrara. It was the last attempt to reunify the Eastern and Western churches. They actually did agree on a statement of faith. They were supposed to all be reunified. And after that, the Pope called for a crusade, sent a bunch of armies to Varna, and this is in Bulgaria, and the Turks annihilated them in 1444. Long story short, they could not stop the inevitable at that point, which was the conquest of Constantinople and Byzantium by the Ottomans. And the Ottomans became the great threat to Europe for the next 150 years. In the 1480s, they landed in southern Italy, took Otranto and one other major city. They were only stopped basically by the death of the Sultan, Mehmed II. Later on, in the 1520s, under Suleiman the Magnificent, they take Belgrade. They seize the island of Rhodes from the Knights of Malta later on. 1526, they defeat the Hungarians and take over that country, and Mohawks in 1526. And then 3 years later, they make it to the gates of Vienna and very nearly overrun it. If they had, it might have opened up the entire continent to them. Thereafter, it begins to slow down, but you still have this, and by the way, the crusading ideal is beginning to decay by the 16th century. I won't go into the changes, you can ask about them later, but there's of course the major battle, naval battle, at least major in Christian terms, at Lepanto in 1571. A combined Christian force defeated an Ottoman force in 1571, which for the most part the Ottomans didn't care about. They still more or less controlled the Mediterranean, but it was a big, huge morale booster for Western Europe at that point. And then finally, I'm skipping over some things. The last major attempt by the Ottomans to march into Europe is the Siege of Vienna in 1683, which, besides the fact that they fail, is a turning point because it begins the long decline of the Ottomans. The Ottomans before this, it's kind of amazing to think of it, they never negotiated with anyone. They just dictated terms, and you went and did it. After the Battle of Vienna, Siege of Vienna was lifted. They actually had to send ambassadors to these Western powers who are now, and it took a long time actually. It wasn't like the West was in a position to dominate the rest of the world like they would. It began the slow receding of their power into history. So you have a series of different types of battles, most of whom I think can be described in defensive terms. But you have that one last charge I have to mention here, which is the charge of colonialism. And I think a lot of this, and I didn't get this myself, it's my sense of reading the literature, some of this has to do, this myth actually comes, this charge of colonialism, it doesn't come originally from Muslims at all. It comes from Western writers, basically. I start with Saladin because Saladin gets this really good reputation as being this very, he's chivalrous, right? He's the figure of chivalry. He gets into Dante. He's among the righteous Gentiles in limbo, right? The reason being, by the way, was when he conquered Jerusalem, he gave free passage to people to get out of there and allow them to worship there. The thing is, we know from Arab sources, he almost never did this in other settings. To give you an example of what he did do, and by the way, I mentioned this as a counterbalance to overly indulgent depictions of Crusaders as being bloodthirsty, and they did do bloodthirsty things, but the battle which broke the kingdom of Jerusalem in 1187 was called the Battle of Hattin, where he cornered the Crusader king, the king of Jerusalem, and his army and a bunch of about 300 Knights Templar. He forced them to surrender, promised them safe passage, and then, according to an Arab source, by the way, brought them before him and then had a crowd of people around him and offered them all silver and gold coins if they would go take a sword and behead all of the Crusaders and the King of Jerusalem. And I mean, people who are not, if you don't know about beheadings, you have to be kind of trained to do it, otherwise it gets messy. And it got messy. And they executed every last one of them, and apparently to Saladin's delight. And I say this, by the way, Saladin was an amazing figure in some ways. He did that, by the way, to try to terrorize the Crusaders and get them out of the Holy Land. Didn't work. That's probably why he didn't do it a second time when he retook Jerusalem, because he didn't want Richard the First of England coming back, whom, by the way, the Muslims were terrified of. Who also committed, by the way, he executed a bunch of Muslim prisoners as a sort of, again, this is violent warfare. They're trying to one-up each other. But this myth, by the way, started by Latin writers at the time. They admired him. They thought he was a great chivalrous figure. Odd, very odd. But it's where that comes from was originally medieval writers.